This will be a review and a discussion of the book The Black Witch. It's a young adult fantasy dystopia novel, and there was some controversy about it when it was published. I'm coming very late to the controversy, so this may be old news for you, or maybe you haven't heard about it before. Either way, I'm going to throw in my 2 cents. I have a cold, so I apologize if my voice sounds a little funny. If I hadn't known that this book was controversial, I honestly would not have ever guessed it would be controversial. It's about as controversial as a Dora the Explorer episode. Nonetheless, controversy was had. Why? I don't know. I did read the review that started the whole furor, and what I got out of that review was, that review was sad. It was like reading a review of Aesop's Fable of Sour Grapes, which said, the grapes weren't really sour. The crow was just lying about that to himself. This is a stupid story. It wasn't really about sour grapes at all. The grapes were fine. Yeah, the grapes were fine. And the crow was lying to himself. That was the point of the story. That is the point of parables. Because if the story had been about a crow who just ate grapes and then he was fine, there wouldn't have been a story. I don't know why that's hard to understand. That seems really strange to me. So apparently this caused controversy. So why? Why was this a controversial story? Well, apparently the entire story is a bit of a parable in the same sense that most dystopian stories are. But this story was a parable of a very sensitive and difficult period of history of country of Rwanda, post-genocide. The heroine obviously represents a Hutu from Rwanda who, at the same time that she's been told by her people that they've always been oppressed by the Tutsis, she begins to learn the Tutsi side of the genocide that her people have perpetrated, and she begins to feel guilty about that. And she begins to realize, wow, prejudice works both ways. There's really more to this story than I've been taught. Everybody has their own version of history, and you really have to be willing to be open to other interpretations of history and other points of view. My people are not the only ones who have grievances. The Tutsis have actually suffered a lot at the hands of my people. And obviously, the whole Rwandan genocide was a horrible, horrible historical event, which many people who are alive today still remember. And so this pain, I suppose, is what was at the heart of the controversy. Okay, maybe I was wrong about that. Maybe the story was actually a parable of a girl who is part of Antifa. That's why her people always dress in black. They're part of the Black Bloc. And she's a member of a cult by any means necessary. And then she goes to this university, and everybody at the university, of course, shuns these 2 people called Icarals, which are demons, which of course clearly represents Trump supporters in their little red Make America Great hat. And of course she hates them at first, and she doesn't want to have anything to do with them because, oh my God, they supported Trump, ew. And then she gradually learns that, maybe there's a different point of view. Maybe you shouldn't demonize people, literally calling them demons just because of something that, maybe they just feel differently about. Here represented by being born with wings. They're just different from other people at the university. Or maybe that's not what the story was about. Maybe the story is a parable about a girl going to university in 1930s Austria, right before the Anschluss, when Germany and Austria unite, when Vogel, the Hitler substitute, comes to power. The point is, you can't prove or disprove any of those scenarios that I just named. We don't know. I mean, of course, the writer could come forward and she could say, this is what I meant it to mean. And that's fine. That's the writer's point of view. But if I wanted to draw a parallel between the events in this story and Rwanda, events in this story and how Trump supporters are treated at left-wing universities, the parallels between Nazi Germany, all of those parallels can be found. And that's what makes a fantasy story or a science fiction story powerful, is that you are not just writing straight up propaganda about real events and people that we all know and recognize and already have very strong opinions about. You are moving beyond the conscious mind into the world of archetypes, into the world of metaphor and myth, so that you can get around our conscious barriers and our own very real prejudices and preconceptions about what this group or that group or this person or that person or this ideology or that ideology represents, and you can explore it in a mythological way in a story. That's what all good stories do, and some of them do it better than others. This one, actually, if I were to have any complaints about this story, it's just that the parable is very on the nose. That's a Hollywood term meaning the metaphor is really obvious. The good guys and the bad guys are really obvious. To me. Apparently not to everybody. But to me it was actually, if anything, a little too black and white, no pun intended, in that there were extremes of good and extremes of evil. And it was very clear from the very first chapter that her society was meant to be evil and that she was going to learn better. All right, well, that's the controversy. If that's what you came for, that's all I gotta say. That's probably what you're gonna get out of this video, and the rest I'm gonna talk about the writing of it and the good parts of the structure and where I thought it was a little weak and could have been shored up a bit. So if you are interested in the story from the point of view of analyzing the story and from the point of view of writing a good story, then keep listening to this video, because that's what the rest of it's going to be about. Structurally, this story is what Heinlein called the man who learned better story. Now, Heinlein famously said that there are three kinds of people interest story. One is the romance, and that can also refer to a bromance. One is the little Taylor story about somebody who achieves a greater position than he started with, or sometimes falls from power. And the third is the man who learned better. He thinks the world works one way and that the good guys are over here and the bad guys are over there, and then he learns that everything he believed is not true. Or a lot of what he believed is not true, depending on how the story is told. In a man that learned better story, I start with a protagonist who has a strongly set opinion. Usually there's a reason that he has this opinion. It may be, in this case of a dystopia, it's that he believes his society is right. Or in this case, it's she believes her society is right. She then begins to encounter a new situation which forces her to question what she believes. But she doesn't instantaneously transform her opinion, because that wouldn't be realistic. If you've ever actually tried to argue with somebody, for instance, on the internet, how quickly do you actually succeed in changing their opinion? You almost never see it happen in front of you. It's not that people don't change their opinion, but they very seldom do so in the course of one conversation. It usually takes many, many conversations, reading new information, meeting new people, finding out new things, before somebody will let go of a cherished opinion and exchange it for a new opinion or a new belief about the world. Furthermore, the more important this opinion or this belief about the world is to that person's sense of identity and their relationships with their family and the people who are important to them and their place in society and their good status and their good reputation, the more difficult it will be to let go of the wrong notion that they hold. Obviously, if changing your opinion about something means that everybody you love and respect is going to turn against you, that you're going to lose your job, your family, your honors that you've been given, your place in society, maybe even your home, that you might not, that you have to give up everything that you fought for. You have to admit that things you may have done in the past were the wrong things, that sacrifices you made in the past may have been for nothing. The more difficult it is for you to admit that you've made a mistake and you have to restart your whole thinking and orient it in a completely different direction, because you have to lose so much in order to gain this new truth. The more you have to lose to gain the new truth, the harder it is going to be. And this is simply how people work, and it works this way for a reason. Because if it were too easy for people to throw away everything they trust and believe in, they would be very easily scammed and led aside by any kind of new fly-by-night idea or sales pitch that somebody throws their way. So people do not easily give up the rock solid beliefs at the core of their very sense of identity. Those are very hard to give up. And in a story, they should be shown as hard to give up. Because in a story, what we want to explore is how can people change? Every story at its heart is about how somebody changes. If there's no change, there's no story. If there's no conflict, there's no story. If the crow sees grapes, the grapes are good, the crow eats them, and the crow is happy, that's not a story. So we have to have some conflict, and the deeper and the more essential you can make it, the better the story is going to be. Now, of course, if you're going to make that the identity that somebody has to give up so deep to their core, then you also have to make the struggle to give up that false belief and the evidence that forces them to finally change to be very convincing in order to have a satisfactory story. So what we have here is an author who has tried to make a person who learned better story, and we have to ask, okay, what did she do that succeeded, and what did she do that maybe could have been done a little better? All right, when it comes to this book and most modern books today, you very seldom have just one layer of a story. So this is mostly, I'm saying, a man who learned better story. But there's also a romance story. So there's also boy meets girl, and there is a love triangle. So it's one girl and two boys. And there's also a lot of other kinds of friendships that she makes. And there's also a frenemy, not really a frenemy, just an enemy. There's also a nemesis, let's put it that way. There's also a nemesis, and that is the heroine's dark mirror, the person who is very like her but represents her dark side, the evil that she could be if she made different choices. So there's a character like that in there. The story's divided into 3 parts. Pretty long book. You could almost have each of those be a separate novella and it would have worked, I think. But it's like the 3-act structure, and in fact it has a 4-act structure. There's a very clear midpoint. The 3-act structure here, though, is part 1, part 2, part 3. I imagine the agent pitching pitching this story to the publisher saying, it's Pride and Prejudice meets Hogwarts, but instead of an elementary school, it's a university. That's how I imagine this story being pitched, because the beginning is like something out of a Jane Austen novel, and the society feels very 19th century or Victorian Britain. The way that their clothes are described makes me think of the fashions in 1890, and the way that the heroine is taken to be introduced to all these young men, and she's expected to become wand-fasted, which I thought was a really cool idea, but I kind of misunderstood what it meant. I thought it was like magic insta-love, or that it would like find your true love for you, or create love between two people. But no, it's just sort of this kind of creepy, magical forced marriage thing where if you break your marriage vows, you're horribly tortured. Who knew? I'm a little disappointed about that, actually. But whatever. Yeah, but it's still cool. It's still an interesting concept. It's used more as an analogy of arranged marriages, where you really do not have the option of divorce. And so if you were not the one who is allowed to choose your partner, you can be really in a bad situation if you don't actually love this person, or if he's a total creeper, or if he's abusive. Like I said, that seems very analogous to me for 19th century society. But then we send the heroine to the university, and this university was a little jarring to me. Even though I did say at the beginning that the whole point of a fantasy land is that it doesn't correspond one-on-one to any actual real historical situation. I had this very strong sense that it was a retelling of the 1930s situation in Europe, and that all these different magical races represented different European peoples, including gypsies and Jews and some that are not considered acceptable. And they, just like the nations in the 1930s Europe, they each have this very strong national pride, and they each, their people are the best and the others are kind of a little bit wonky or wrong, and they each have their own set of customs and their own values. And that's fine. So it's a multicultural society, but it's like a newly multicultural society. I didn't think it felt at all like anything in contemporary America. Some people saw that analogy. If so, it didn't feel very real to me at all. It didn't feel at all like contemporary multicultural society. It didn't feel like contemporary Europe, because every single society was very nationalist and racist in a way that just felt much more antiquated. And to be honest, felt much more in keeping with how most nations and most tribes and most peoples throughout human history have behaved and treated each other, which is that most peoples throughout human history have considered themselves at the center of the earth and everybody else a little bit less than human, or at least really weird. So in that sense, it felt natural that these people are all racist, because that's kind of the human condition. All human groups are sort of naturally ethnocentric. If you're going to overcome that, you have to make a conscious effort to overcome that. People get dogmatic about their own culture, and modern university students who think that they're so politically correct are very ethnocentric about being politically correct. They're just as insufferably self-righteous about that as the people that they're supposedly criticizing. It's very hard to get around thinking that your ideas are best, because if you hold the ideas, you try to hold the best ideas that you know of. So of course you think they're best. That's human nature. The trick is, how do you not behave like a complete dick while thinking that you do have the best ideas that you know about? Anyway, that's just my own little rant. Sorry about that. But I think that part is realistic. One problem I have in dystopias that I was really expecting to find in this book, and I didn't find it, and I was glad. I thought this was to the book's credit. But a lot of dystopias make a mistake of having modern Western person inserted randomly into a dystopia. Now, that would be one thing if you were talking about a person visiting from our world into a new magical fantasy world. And that fantasy world is, to our modern Western person, dystopian, because you can have somebody from our world go into a fantasy world and they can find it very dystopian, and they can look at it from the point of view of some modern person with all of our values about homosexuality being fine, about marriage, about women's rights, about sliced bread, whatever the values are that most of us, let's be honest, pretty much share, because that's how we grew up. But if you have somebody that is supposed to have grown up in your utopia, or in your dystopia, where these values are the norm, where homosexuality is seen as sinful, being born with wings is seen as sinful, girls are expected to get married young and have large families. If these are the values that the culture has, these are the values that your hero or heroine would have, because most people have the values of the culture they grow up in. If they have different values, you have to explain where those came from. This author actually did a good job of making the heroine have a credible reason for being slightly different than the people around her. She was raised somewhat in isolation, literally in the backwoods of her society. She was very protected by her uncle, and he's obviously somewhat liberal by their standards, but yet she still shares a lot of the values of her culture. And she's a good citizen of her society. And that's an important thing about the man who learns better storyline. You're not talking about a character flaw. Well, let me qualify that. If you're combining it with a dystopian story, you're not talking about a character flaw. You can also do the same story with a character flaw. The story of Scrooge and Christmas, it's his character flaw that he learns better about. His approach to Christmas, which represents his entire approach to life. In a combination story of person who learns better, dystopia, it's the dystopia that is wrong. And the reason that the person is in the wrong is because they fit well into their dystopian society. Unfortunately, their dystopian society has warped values. So in order to straighten out their values, they have to become unfit for their society. And that's where the struggle comes in. Because you're asking the character to become less well adapted to the circumstances that they're in, but more well adapted to life as it really is, or values as they really should be, the good and the true. So at the beginning of the story, Ellerin fits into her society. She has many of the attributes of a young woman of her society that is considered respectable. She's shy, she's unsure of herself, she's very inexperienced with men, so she really falls hard for the first guy who pays attention to her and is charming to her, and it's very understandable, by the way, why she does that. It's shown in a romantic way. The reader can see through it that maybe he's not really the right guy for her, but not immediately, and I liked that. At first, it was not clear to me if the guy she first falls for... God, I should have said spoilers. Spoilers. The guy she first falls for, when we first meet him, he seems very romantic and he seems very kind to her. And it's only later as we get to know him better that we begin to see the flaws in his character. That yes, he's charming, yes, he's charismatic, yes, he's intelligent, yes, he's skilled, yes, he's rich and respectable, but there's a streak of cruelty in him, and that's what finally becomes the deal breaker for her with this guy. And we sense when she immediately refuses, he proposes to her almost instantly, like the day after they meet, and she refuses. And as soon as she refused, I sensed, okay, I bet this isn't the right guy for her. That was my instinct, and it turned out to be correct. But I wasn't positive because, and I liked that I wasn't positive because that part of the story was told with enough subtlety that I couldn't tell, is this guy going to be a bad guy? Or is he only seem like a bad boy, but he really has a heart of gold? Didn't know yet. Now, by the time she got to the university and she met the second guy in the love triangle, I kind of guessed who the real hero was going to be. So it wasn't that subtle. And overall, this book was not really that subtle. But, you know, it wasn't that subtle, but it was still a good book. So starting in the second third of the book, does that make sense? It's actually the first, what's called book one, is actually the first quarter of the book. Book two is kind of the middle two quarters and then the fourth quarter. So it's actually better to think of this book as being divided into a 4-part structure, even though it says it's divided into a 3-part structure. She goes to a university, and it's certainly possible for a university that has different values than the mainstream culture to exist. I mean, we know this happens. We know that cultures are not monothematic like they are often portrayed in stories. So to its credit, this culture has its more moderate and liberal ends, and it has its more conservative and fanatic ends. And that's realistic. I like that part. I would have liked a little more explanation about why the people at the university seemed so much more liberal than everybody else in the society, and not just their society, but every other society in the world. That was a little strange. It was like modern university members of some, a bunch of San Franciscans got transported magically to this world, and they're the ones who started the university. And so this one university has these values like something out of San Francisco 2017, and then the rest of the world is like 19th century Europe. Really? Okay. So even though the heroine did not seem like a transport from our modern society, inappropriately so, the university itself almost did. And I think it's just a little more world building onto that, like they belong to the school of mage so-and-so, which has always had a more integrationalist approach and says that magic should be drawn from many creatures and advocates reconciliation. And now this mage's school of thought is on the decline, and this other mage, the evil Hitler substitute, Vogel/Voldemort, I'm just kidding, Vogel, that he, his school of thought is now on the rise. And okay, whatever. It wasn't it's really a minor nitpick, but it's just a little bit of world building I would have liked to have seen a little more about to make me feel this university made sense in this universe where everybody else seems very intolerant. and yet the university staff are completely trying to integrate all the different races together and make everybody love everybody. And then, spoiler alert, they're all part of the resistance. Sometimes I felt like we were going back more toward a more modern 20th century Hitler analogy society. Now, I've said that it seemed like a combination of Pride and Prejudice and Harry Potter. Obviously, when we get to the university part of the story, we have a much stronger Harry Potter analogy because she's at this university. So although it's college level, there's a schoolgirl feel. She's making new friends. She's making new enemies. She has a nemesis who just makes her life a living hell. But she also pranks her nemesis and does some bad things to her nemesis. So it's more like a rivalry. That was another thing that some people found very controversial, that she had an enemy who was a girl. Girls can have enemies, like real people. Why is that a problem? I didn't really care for the relationship, but only because I found that the other girl, her enemy, was kind of a shallow character. She was a two-dimensional villain, let me just put it that way. So I would have preferred a little bit more depth to the villain, but I'm going to get into that because that was actually a problem with the entire storyline. It wasn't just this character just embodied it. When you have a person who learned better story, what you're going to do is flip the script. At some point, you're going to take the script, not the literal script or the script of the story that the author is writing, but the script that your character has been taught. Their worldview is going to turn upside down. And that should start to happen strongly around the midpoint. And that's exactly what happens in this story. When she first goes to the university, initially, all her prejudices are confirmed. And that's good storytelling, by the way. I thought that was actually great. The characters that she's been told are evil treat her like crap. That made them more human to me. Like, they also have their prejudices. They aren't these freaking saints. They also hate her kind hates their kind. It's a whole hating thing. And they don't treat her nicely because, as far as they're concerned, why should they? They think she's the enemy. She thinks they're the enemy, and when they first meet, they both get that confirmed. And that seems very realistic. There's a Quaker group that brings together, or they used to do this, I don't know if they still do, but they used to bring together Israelis and Palestinians into this camp, and they were trying to teach them about peace. And what they found is that on the first day, when they initially started this camp, they would get them all together and they would immediately start talking about politics. And instead of creating peace, they would just put a face to their loathing that they had always been taught their whole life. And so they would go out of this, meeting or the first couple of days of this camp, and they would be saying things like, I always knew I hated Jews. I just didn't know why. Now I know why. And, I used to believe that there could be peace with the Palestinians, but now I know that it will always be war, and whoa. The Quakers were very upset by this. This was not what they wanted to happen. When people first get together with someone they've been taught to hate their whole life, or someone they feared their whole life, their initial thing is not to sing Kumbaya. That is not a realistic story. So I liked that when she gets to this university, the first things that happen to her are that all her worst fears and prejudices and bad feelings are all confirmed very dramatically, and that made sense and it was believable. And then of course she becomes hardened in her position, and before she's just been kind of taught about, you can't trust these people, and now she knows it. So that was actually fine for me. I didn't think that was unrealistic at all. And it makes it difficult for her there's then yet another hurdle, which is again, how you want the story to go, because this person has to give up all their cherished beliefs. You can't make that too easy for them. So she now has another hurdle to overcome. And yet by the midpoint, very realistically, she gets into kind of this prank war with some of her rivals. And she's not exactly without her flaws as a character. She does definitely have her problems, and she has a temper. And when she gets mad at somebody, she goes out and she tries to do something to them, then they try to do something back to her. And then, where she gets into trouble, she asks one of her love interests, the bad one, who's like not a nice person, she finds out, to help her out with the kind of prank, and then he does something really cruel and he goes way too far for her, and she realizes, whoa, what am I doing? Why am I doing this to this other person? She finally sort of learns some empathy with this person. She realizes she doesn't want to be this person who's being cruel, and she recognizes her position of power vis-a-vis this other person, and that she can abuse it and they can't really retaliate. So, it's one thing if they're doing school kid pranks on each other, but there's this power disparity. And I thought that's kind of what helps launch her into this realization that, maybe I'm not in the right here. So this is almost exactly at the midpoint of the story. It's the chicken incident, and I won't give complete spoilers for it. It was sad. It was a sad scene, but it's an important scene in the book, and it was interesting. And so this is where she starts to transition into the new way of thinking. And it still doesn't happen immediately, which also still makes sense, right? But this is also where she begins to see that the guy that she thought was a good guy is really not a good guy, and she begins to think differently about some of the other friends or people that she didn't think could be friends, and now she would like them to be friends, and they're not her friends yet, but she would like them to be. So this is where she starts to shift and change. And then by the end of it's really the third of a 4-act series, but by that end of that book 3, now she's finally made the commitment. And then we go into what should be the climax of the story, and it's the third book in the story, and now the political situation around them is becoming more difficult. They don't exactly have an Anschluss, but the country that they're in is not actually her home country. Her home country is like the Germany analogy, and then her country is sort of like the Austria analogy. And I just, at the beginning of this, I said, don't make analogies to real situations, and here I am doing that. That's stupid of me. I'm an idiot. Oh well. Anyway, what happens is that the country she's in sort of more aligns itself with the evil politics of the evil mage, Vogel, Voldemort, Hitler dude. And so everybody who has been in this sort of, liberal bubble, this little safe haven, a safe space for them where they can have this sort of integrationist dream, that dream comes to an end and they realize, oh my gosh, now everybody's going to be sent to death camps or sent to slave labor camps or drafted and sent to the front to go conquer our neighbors. This is terrible. And so they realize we have to take some critical steps. And this is a little bit of a spoiler. There's a mission where they go to rescue a dragon and escape, fly away from here. Except I think she ends still at the university. So yeah, I have to do some spoilers because I have to discuss the ending. The biggest problems in this book were not that it's a dangerous book that needs to be kept away from small children and weak minds because it might influence them. I'm sorry, side rant. People actually said this book was dangerous. Are you kidding me? If you think books are dangerous, you are the Nazi. Hello? You are the Nazi if you think a book is dangerous and that you have the right to tell other people what to read. Get over yourself, you frickin' censor. Dang. Anyway, sorry about that. Back to the non-dangerous book. It did have some problems as a book. One of the problems is that it actually had a very shallow view of good and evil, in my opinion. All the characters who were good believe every single thing that a politically correct university student of our own day would believe, and all the characters who were bad were against those same things. That was the problem I had with it. Like the villainess. She is the dark mirror of the heroine. That's fine as a character. I had no problem with them having a rivalry. That was fine. But she's so over the top, just evil. And everybody who's evil thinks that women are inferior to men. That their people are the best race on the earth and should conquer and slave or murder all other races. That gays should all be killed. That you should put selkies into prostitution and wipe out the fae. They all share the same exact values, and then all the good characters share the same exact values, even though they're supposed to be from a multiplicity of cultures. And that just seemed a little too pat for me. Why couldn't you have made the villainess a feminist? I mean, she had every reason to be. She was in the military in a society that didn't want women in the military. And yet she wasn't shown as at least being an advocate for that position. That was kind of strange. Why would she want to have a society where women are forced to get married and stay at home? That would crimp her style, wouldn't it? I don't know. So those kind of things. And then every single good character, well, no, they did a little better with the good characters. The good characters also each had their own prejudice against, the good characters each had their own prejudices against each other. So the one who was a demon, Icarol, didn't like werewolves, and the werewolf wanted to eat her chickens, and so on. So those characters were a little more well-rounded, and it made them a little bit more likable. The flipping of the narrative, the flipping of the script was very transparent. You could see right from the start that the heroine was going to have to reject her society, and that's pretty common in dystopias. I like it better when the writer can actually kind of sell you on the character believing in this world and even sell you on this world. It's much harder to do and it's much more rare. So I'm not going to take off points or take off stars or something from the book for not achieving that because it's pretty hard to do. But I do like that in a dystopia if you can do that. Let me give an example of what I mean. In 1984, you certainly never think that the society that he's in is a great society. But one of the things that happens is that when he's recruited, he and his girlfriend are recruited by somebody from the underground resistance. They're asked this question: what would you do to overthrow this government? would you throw acid in a child's face, etc., etc.? And they say, yes, we would, yes, we would. And then at the end of that book, when he's in the Ministry of Love or whatever it is, and he's being tortured, one of the ways they break down his humanity is they play back that tape of him saying he would do that. And they show him that there's no resistance, because even in his resistance to the horrible dictatorship, he has completely absorbed the values of the horrible dictatorship, the anti-humanist values, and he doesn't hold them any more than anybody else. He would throw acid in a child's face. So why shouldn't acid be thrown in his face? And it's just devastating. You don't see it coming. At the time that he says that, I mean, I remember reading that book and reading that scene, and he's like, yeah, I'll throw acid in a child's face. And I'm like, what? Wait, what? I don't know about that. But I accepted that he believed it, and I kind of went along with it. And then when it came back to bite me, then I was like, oh, that little voice inside me said that was wrong. I knew that was wrong. Some part of me knew that was wrong, but I went along with it because I hated this society so much. And yet that shows you how much of a part of that society he's become. That's brilliant. Okay, that's 1984, a huge classic. So this is a young adult book. The younger your audience, the kind of more obvious you make your moral. By Aesop's Fables, usually a really simple and obvious moral. You know when the hare and the turtle start racing, who's gonna win? Well, you know that even if you didn't already know the story, you would guess that, because you would think, well, if the rabbit won, why would you be telling me this story? Because that's who would obviously win, so it couldn't be the rabbit, it's gotta be the turtle. But when you're 3, you don't see that twist coming. You're surprised that the slow turtle won. It's amazing to you. Oh my god, a turtle beat a rabbit. That's awesome. And that's why Dora the Explorer things and cartoons have much more obvious plots and much more obvious morals, and they will sometimes come out and state it for you at the end. Kids, the moral of the story is XYZ. So this was meant for young adults, and I almost felt like it was meant for middle school. I almost felt like somebody came out at the end and said, kids, the moral of the story is racism is bad. But then again, some reviewers still didn't seem to get that message, so maybe they did need to be that obvious. I don't know. It could also be that there were other structural problems with this book that exacerbated this feeling of everything being on the nose. If you look at the Harry Potter books, the first thing you see is that she combines 2 genres. She combines a story about being in school with a high fantasy genre story. Those are very difficult to combine, because a high fantasy is high drama. It's epic. It has all these rich tapestries of different places and creatures and adventures, very high stakes, life and death, save the world, etc. Slay dragons, rescue princesses, and then you have the school story, which is about having a mean substitute teacher. Now, how do you combine those 2 things? It's very difficult to do, because again, the structure of a fantasy is usually of a journey, going to different places, and the conflicts have to ratchet up higher and higher and higher by the end of the story, so that you finally meet this big bad villain and have this huge epic battle against this villain. That's your typical high fantasy story. Whereas, what do you do in school? You go to school, and then the next day you go to school, and then the next day you go to school, and then again with the school, and then again with the school, and then again with the school. School is known to be boring. Now, I know it shouldn't be boring. I'm a parent. I shouldn't say school is boring, but let's face it, it's kind of boring, and it's very hard to write about in a way that's not boring. And when you do put conflicts into a school setting, there are conflicts with friends, there a big test coming up, there who's going to ask me to the dance. It's very difficult to combine that with freeing dragons and fighting princesses or whatever they're doing. So what does J.K. Rowling do that makes it work so seamlessly? She adds a third element. The third element that she adds is a mystery story. So that every school year, conveniently, there is a mystery that the kids find out about at the beginning of the year and finally solve by the end of the year. And that mystery is also what leads to the battle with the sub-villain, the part of Voldemort or the minion of Voldemort, who is the bad guy for that book. And every book accelerates the drama and ratchets it up another level. And every chapter in the book ratchets it up another level. By stringing along these clues, it connects this otherwise boring string of going to school, talking with friends, having tests, squabbling with schoolmates. None of that has any accelerating or ratcheting drama. But when you add a mystery to it, you collect a clue, you collect another clue, you collect another clue. There's advancement in the story, and then the culmination of the book feels like a culmination because you're solving the mystery and now fighting the bad guy. So that third element, school, fantasy, mystery, is what makes the Harry Potter books work so well. And that mystery element is what's missing from this book. Now, I'm not saying she had to make this book a mystery, but she's missing a MacGuffin tale, or she's missing some other third element to draw the fantasy and the school element of the story together, so that the book feels more like watching a series on television where there is an overarching plot, but mostly you're watching an episode and then another episode and then another episode. So you get an episode about don't be racist against werewolves. And then the next week's episode is don't be racist against Selkies. And then the next week's episode is don't be racist against Fae. And then the next week's episode, and do you see what I mean? It starts to get monotonous after a while because every episode sort of stands alone. It doesn't have any higher drama than the episode before. And by the time they got to the end, when they have this what's supposed to be the epic battle against the dragon, to save the dragon, and there's also bad dragons, and there's good dragons, etc. It's supposed to be this epic culmination of the book. To me, it felt just like one more episode in the series. Don't be racist against dragons. The end. And then they're set up for another year at the school. Not quite clear where the second book is going to be. I do have it. Heroine would have been more likable if she had had a clear goal, a clear outward journey goal to strive for. That's what was missing. That's what the mystery serves in the Harry Potter books. It's the MacGuffin story that you go for, the thing that unites everyone. The heroine had an inward journey, and the author clearly had that in mind. The inward journey was to overcome her prejudice. And I think the author did a passable to good job of showing her overcoming her prejudice. And to do that, she had to show she was prejudiced to begin with, because otherwise, no story. She overcomes her prejudice and she has this inward journey. And that part was fine, but without an outward journey to kind of distract us, that's all we had to focus on. There was only this inward journey, whereas if there had been something else on the outside drawing these characters together, sort of like the dragon rescue at the end did, but that was one chapter, some overarching storyline for this book that forced her to go to the other characters and say, this is going to happen. I know you don't like me, I don't like you, but we have to do this. Why does Jon Snow go to the wildlings and bring them past the wall? He doesn't just do that because he suddenly realized that, gosh, prejudice against wildlings is bad. Even though that may be one of the themes that the author is showing through the story, that is not what Jon Snow thinks when he goes to Hardhome and he says to the wildlings, you don't like me and I don't like you. Those zombies out there are gonna kill all of us if we don't work together. There's an outward plot that forces them to grow, that forces them to overcome their feelings for each other. And that's what this book needed so badly. Needed that overarching quest or goal. And then I think it would have been a much stronger book. Overall, however, it was well written. It was enjoyable, especially if you don't have my stupid hang up about first person present tense. Good writing, good scenery. The characters, pretty good, a little black and white. Again, no pun intended. But, and a recommend for a fantasy dystopia. The next book is Wand Fasted. I'm interested to see where it goes with that, if she actually is going to finally hook up with one of the guys, and if she hooks up with the bad guy, what is that going to mean for her? Is she still going to be in school, or are they going to change the location? That will be interesting to see. I'm hoping that there will be more of an overarching goal throughout the story in the second book, so I'd like to see how that goes. But it's still like 600 pages of first person present tense. I just don't like this, so I'm probably going to read another book in between just to kind of cleanse my palette of that tense, and then I'll try and get back to the second book in the series, and so I can review that. Maybe I'll put the two reviews up around the same time. I don't know. This is obviously going to be a very long review, and it's going to take me forever to edit it. And I don't know if it's still going to be controversial, but maybe everybody's over the controversy. I mean, not actually trying to be controversial, but I figured there are such things as forbidden books in young adult novels these days. People are trying to tell you with a straight face that you shouldn't read a book because it might be dangerous. That's why we read. Why would you forbid somebody to read a book? Any book. That makes no sense to me. But this review has gone on long enough. I hope that the longer format and the analysis of the controversy and of the storyline was somewhat helpful. If not, well, and if it wasn't, I have nothing to say to that. All right, I need to stop babbling. Tara out.